Aloha kako. Wahiki mai. Wavehe ia mai le ka papahana. Aloha e ka poe e ho'olohe meiana, e nana meiana, e ia kako. I'm Puakea Nogelmeier. I guess I'm the moderator here. So I'll remain moderate as we go. And I am delighted to be spending time with my cohort in crime, Jane Goodsill. I'm a retired Hawaiian language professor. I'm emeritus, so I still play at the university. I get to choose the work that I play at. I run a nonprofit translation training organization called Awaiaulu, and that keeps me very busy. Ran into Jane Goodsill, and our destinies were wed. So, Jane, how did we meet up, or who are you?
That's about how I feel. We've met and our destinies were wed. I was doing this project to try and find out more about my father's work. My father was a corporate attorney in Honolulu. And when I was about 13, went to go see him in court. And I expected Perry Mason. And it was like paint drying. It was the most boring. He was a very mild-mannered reporter. He didn't say anything for about an hour. And when he did, it was very dull. It was all about the Hawaiian electric rate change, what the public would pay for their electricity. And it's very skilled work, but I had no idea. I thought he was just a flunky. So I never thought that much about what my father did at work after that until I started my project. And then I began to realize so many of the things that he did and the passion with which he did them and the brilliance of his mind, because people told me. In my real life, in my professional life, I was a licensed professional counselor and worked for many years with almost anybody who came in the door. And I love that. And there was a certain point in time when I retired from that and started doing other work, but it wasn't fulfilling for me until I stumbled upon doing oral histories in the county that I live in. And after 10 years of doing that, coming back to Hawaii all the time, I finally thought, what am I doing? Why aren't I doing this in Hawaii? And so I started with people who knew my father. And then a friend said, you need to do Alice Guild. So that was wonderful. And Alice Guild said, you need to do Puakea. So, I humbly, call on you. And I was worried because you're big smoke, right? And I'm going to ask this big guy if he's going to, if he will interview with little old me. And when I came, you just opened your door, you opened your heart, and you gave me such a heartfelt interview.
But now I work with Hawaiian language material, and a lot of that, most of it is historical language. And a lot of it is sort of the excitement of a nation that was moving from an oral society into a literate society. And they moved fast and they moved hard, and they really put down a lot of what had been held in memory for generations was suddenly put down in writing. And I loved reading that. And I'm still entertained every day with that process of documenting. And then though, you turned it into a book. It started off as a book about your father, but it really became something larger.
No, it didn't start off at a book at all. It was just, I was taking oral histories to preserve for posterity. Someday I'm going to give all my transcripts to some worthy archival source, and they'll be available for researchers like you. I'm taking modern history, you're looking at ancient history, but someday, 50 years from now, what I talk about will have been lost. And so I'm going to preserve it. So I was just taking oral histories to preserve it for my community. But the stories were so good that I couldn't resist. And so I started to collect the best stories and put them in like chapters and came up with a book called Voices of Hawaii. And I have a picture of it right here.
Oh, good job. Yeah.
This is how it came out. One of the things about this is that I have no agenda. in my story. I'm collecting stories and sharing them. I'm not preferring this person's story over this person's story. One day, you and I went on a ride out to Makaha to interview somebody. And on the way, I was saying, oh, there's some big things happening and there's controversy here and this person feels this. And how do we think about it? And you were so comforting to me because you said, this is how some people feel and this is how some people, and reasoned minds need to figure out a way that we can talk even though we have different opinions. But the point is, in my stories, I can say there's room at the table for everybody's story, and if people disagree, I can still put both of them in the book.
Yes, and bring in different perspectives on the same kind of thing.
Yes, which shows a bigger picture.
Yeah.
So one of the things about being an oral historian is not to have an agenda before you start, just to listen to the story. And I wanted to ask you, in the history of the oral tradition, tell me something about that history in Hawaii specifically.
Thank you. I kind of jumped over that. The ancient society here was totally oral. There was no written language. And so that was actually formalized. It was, sort of set up into the system. There had to be memorizers. Oh. And so young children who were adept at that, when it was seen, that was sort of a strength of theirs, they would actually be shepherded and trained to be a memorizer. And an example is, it was 1862, I think. There's in the newspaper, there's a chant that was written, not written, but composed by Kamehameha I for the birth of his second son, Kauikeaoli. Now that's probably 1811, 1812. There isn't a written form of language. So he composed it. And I used to teach that in my poetry class. He may have worked on it for a long time, but he presented it. Are you impressed? The conqueror was a poet. And they're terribly impressed. And I say, well, I'm not that impressed because, it's something one can do. But someone was assigned to hear him chant that and memorize it on the spot. And then they couldn't write it down. They had to hold it in memory. And then it didn't get written down. It may have been written down in family papers, but it didn't get written down for the newspapers for 50 years. So the person who memorized it isn't the person who wrote it down. So they handed that down a whole generation. So that notion of memory as a social skill, a society skill, was still functioning, it seems, at least until literacy kind of took over. And they were so delighted, Hawaiians were so pleased that you could download this material and have it be safe. And there were lots of discussions in the newspapers. They'd forever be saying, write it down, lest it be lost. And the idea of a knowledgeable old person who dies is like a library burning down. And so get it in print. And we have lots of quotes where they're literally saying, put it in print, save it. So the idea of a chant like that being held as a family responsibility for 2 generations before finally it could be written down.
You and I talked for several hours when I took your interview, but this is not something we talked about. Listening to you now, just talk briefly, there are 2 things that come up. And if I were the oral historian, this is what I would focus on. The role of memory, that young children were trained, and this was a family responsibility.
And both of those are really important. And by fluke, our archives, the state archives, is named after Kekaunuohi, who is a daughter of Kamehameha, and they are a niece, but mother of King Lunalilo. She, as a young girl, was trained as a memorizer. So that was, she was in the chiefly circles, but that was one of her skills. So she was known as a memorizer. She was one of the repositories. Now, later on, she becomes the prime minister of the nation. How remarkable is that? Can you imagine having a president or even a vice president who was also an archive of memory? We've had some scholar presidents, but I think this sort of outdoes it. And the fact that the archives is named after her is not necessarily because of that link. She was a living archive, but it's because she owned the property upon which the building was built. But ironic, even though it's historically links up, and maybe we can grant those contractors of the 1920s with some foresight. People all around the world really will find resonance, similarities, shared concerns. I mean, there's, you know, I read big blocks of the interviews that you were able to share with me, and being able to see that, you know, these people's responses to events or the inspirations or motivations were very much similar to the ones that I had had. And so that's a piece of it too, is hearing the real stories allows a different kind of, I think, connection perhaps. So,
you know, there's something else about this that occurs to me as we're talking. If a person didn't want their story to be public, put in a book or something like that, no problem. It could be held confidential. If they wanted it for the archives, it could be saved and released if they approve of it, or upon their death, or never, or just to their families. That's fine too. It's really just more of a gift back to the community than me taking something from them.
No, it actually, and the whole notion of not being extractive. How does what you do not be extractive? And the fact that you sort of enable that person to have their story documented, and then say, you can have it just for yourself. You can include it in the archive, or you can let me include it in some of the projects that I'm doing. But the idea of having that documented, that's not taking from that community, that person, that area. That's actually adding to it. So it's, you know, there's lots of discussion on sort of decolonizing methodologies, you know, the sort of, we are the experts, go in, get the good stuff, and, you know, make use of it, make best and highest use of it, which has been really damaging for a couple of centuries. So the notion of how does your work foster the place from which you're drawing resources? How does you being able to use those resources benefit that foundation of resource? And
well, I'll tell you,
I think in ways this kind of work very much does. You know, it just that idea of, you might talk to some tutu, and that's the only real, she may decide not to share that story, but her family will have that, or his family. And I think, you know, we did a program for 12 years called Kaleo Hawai'i. Larry Kimura set it up in 1972. They stopped it in 85, I think. And as a language teacher, we really missed that resource. And all it was talk story with elders. It was a little bit like what you're doing. There's actually a real relevance. So we started it up again in 89, you know, totally unskilled and unprepared, and yet ready. We launched it for 12 years. We hosted people and just talked, and we talked about whatever came up. Sometimes there'd be an idea, sometimes it was just whatever came up in the course of conversation. But that record is actually now a remarkable resource for the families of those, and they were almost all elders. So for the families of those elders, for students who are trying to get the sound of language today. It's audio, we didn't type script them all. Larry's 15 years or 13 years of programs have all been type scripted. So there's a written document. So it adds value for language learning, and for, you know, your work probably helps to document linguistically. It might help document some of the regional variations, even though they're all done in English. English is different on Maui than it is on Oahu.
Well, I didn't know that, though I can tell that there are some differences. You know, one of the things that I don't know what to do about is that in order to make the final transcript smooth, like you said, readable, and an accurate representation of what you say. We take out all the ums and ahs. If you say Fred said it, no, Joe said it, no, so-and-so said it, leave all that out and just go to the heart of the matter. So the transcript no longer matches the audio. And so I don't intend to release the audios, though I have them all.
Now, would you, when you develop an archive, and it's going to be eventually, you said this will be someplace, worthy, would the audio be part of that?
Well, look at it this way. I gave you your transcript, which was written, and you edited it and approved it and have all the correct data in there, the years, the dates, the names, the spellings. That no longer matches what you said.
Of course.
So I have your approval to use the written transcript, but I don't have your approval to use the audio because it's not as accurate a representation.
No, I hadn't really, you never asked about. So the audio just sort of lives in limbo.
I have it, but I don't feel like it would be a responsible thing to release it. And one woman who's a little younger than me says, I'm sitting here with my mother and my son. So we have 3 generations. Why would all 3 of us want to read this book?
Good question.
I thought so. So I said, would you introduce me to your mother? She said, yes, this is Carol. So I turned to Carol and I said, Carol, when did your people come to Hawaii? And she said, around the turn of the century. I said, from where? She said, from Japan. And I said, what for? They said, for a better life. And I said, what did they do when they got here? And she said, they worked in the plantation. Then I turned to the 20-year-old and I said, do you know what it was like to work on the plantations? He looks me right in the eye and he says, no. Bless his little heart. He says he has no idea. And I say, well, what people have told me is it was hot and it was sweaty and it was dirty and you were unappreciated and it was cold and it was muddy and you didn't get much money. You didn't get clean very much. You had to go to work whether you were hungover or whether you were pregnant. And the woman who's close to my age starts crying, tears streaming down her face. And I go and put my hand on her shoulder and I say, does that make you sad? And she says, oh, I remember my grandmother telling me that she had that experience with the pregnancy. And she said all that they went through. And I went, I know. And it was just quiet. Then I said to the grandmother, and what was the one thing your family wanted for you? And I hold out the microphone. And she and I both say at the same moment, education. And I said, and have you educated this one? Meaning the daughter? Yes. And have you educated this young man? Yes. He's gone to Punahou and now he's in college on the mainland. And then I look at him and I say, that is your heritage. And he had no idea. And so I turned to the girl and I said, that's why all 3 generations could read it. The mother could find out about remembrance of what her people went through. The next generation could talk about what their experiences were, and the young one could learn from it.
Now, I was going to ask, are there particular interviews that stood out for the impact on you? And I'm sure that might be a long and convoluted list, I think.
Well, it is because each person touches me in a unique way. And I will say, just like my reader who said every chapter, after, my brother and my friend DC Mist Eichelberger were my 2 sort of confidants as I was going through this. And after each interview, I'd be so full to the brim of people trusting me with telling me significant life experiences, stories of racial prejudice and conquering it or not, After every interview, I'd come away and my heart would just be, and I'd call John and I'd say, best interview ever. And then the next day, best interview ever. So to me, it's just a continuum of amazing experiences. Gosh, you're really getting to the heart of me, Puakea.
Well, and I think it's, I only have my own experience in what we did. I think we must have spent 3 hours perhaps in conversation. It could have been 4, I don't know. I don't recall, but are most of them between 2 and 4 hours?
No, I started out doing about 1 hour and then I realized, no, that won't work. And so now I don't really have a time limit, but most end at around 2 hours. When you go to therapy, sessions are an hour, and that's because if you do deep work, you get tired. So when you're taking an oral history, people can talk for a long time about themselves, but around the 2-hour mark, it's beginning to wind up. So between an hour and a half and 2 hours is usually the
I just remember having you for the afternoon. Sort of.
Oh, I know, wasn't it nice?
Enjoying it immensely. We may have turned off the tape and then wandered on and then played. And then we had the opportunity to spend time afterwards.
Yes.
But I'm thinking, so in 100 interviews, you've published 75 and you have 25 more in your belt. Yeah. That's hundreds of hours of time. And that's the actual time on the ground. Yeah. Because just to get into my living room took a couple of phone calls. It took then the visit over here. And then there's, getting the typescripts done, getting that back to me. So each of those is and you're not doing the actual typing, right? You're having someone else.
I pay somebody to type the transcripts verbatim.
How clever, or you'd have little flat finger stubs.
And then when she gets the transcripts back to me, I call that original transcript and save it. Oh, like archiving all this data is a whole skill in itself. I have to save that. I have to save the legal document. I have to save all the contact data. I have to save the original audio. And then I start editing to make it readable and coherent. Yeah. That takes a lot of time. And then I have to send it to you. And you have to receive it, review it, send it back. I have to update it, but a lot of time. But this is what I get up for. This is what, it gives me meaning in my life. I'm so lucky. Not everybody has meaning in their life after they retire from their work.